Okay, so today what we're going to do is discuss negotiation best and worst tactics. As is often the case when I'm planning what we're going to talk about for these sessions, it's often really more a reflection of what's really irking me at the moment. So this is another one of these cathartic opportunities to go through the things that really I find irritating, but I also think there are certain items that are just objectively better or worse. What? I'm good? Oh. So, all right, so, and don't anyone sit in the front row. Hopefully Max will come back. Okay, so we did this was in the last month's session, but it applies to this and it just sort of lays the overall landscape out, so I'm going to run through this again. When representing a buyer, seller, landlord, tenant, or other client as an agent, realtors pledge themselves to protect and promote the interest of their client. The obligation to the client is primary, but it does not relieve realtors of their obligation to treat all parties honestly. So everything we talk about needs to be viewed against the backdrop of the code and our obligation to protect and promote our client's best interest, but also to treat all parties honestly. Realtors should submit offers and counteroffers objectively and as quickly as possible. So I'm going to start with worst practices, and I'll be very eager for any of you to interrupt and sort of interject your own, but here's a common one. You get an overzealous or emotionally charged agent who can be more offended than the client was, and then the agent becomes the obstacle in an otherwise viable negotiation. And the reason that we find that this happens so often is because most good residential agents are emotionally driven decision makers. They are not purely analytical decision makers. So put differently, your clients like you probably because you've got a good personality. That's part of why you're not an engineer. And so if you get somebody, and I mentioned engineers or accountants, you look at the stereotypical professions that are almost purely analytical decision making, and oftentimes you would think, man, thank God that person's not in sales, because they're not the most outgoing, bubbly people. So you go back to the more common end of the spectrum for residential realtors in particular, because a lot of that analytical personality type applies to commercial practitioners when you think about it. But you go back into residential, where you're helping shop for somebody's own home or sell the home in which they have lived and made memories, and you're going to tend to have an emotionally charged personality type that is most likely to gravitate toward this part of the business and is most likely to actually do really well in the business. The clients like them because they have a good personality, because they're an emotionally driven decision maker. Just be mindful of the fact that that very same asset becomes a liability if it turns out to be the only thing standing between your client and actually getting a deal together because you're taking something too personally. Any good horror stories? Now, I can immediately think of the most stereotypical agents who are always amped up over it. Okay, surely you have some. Failure to preserve goodwill. This is very, very frequently overlooked. So price isn't everything. Are you better off to conclude the negotiations with the other party feeling like they've been bled dry, followed by more bloodletting after you have the inspection? Or are you better off being more conciliatory, making the negotiations go a little easier so that the other party doesn't feel like they've just been run through a ringer, leaving some goodwill in the bank, so if you need something else after the home inspection, if there's radon, if there's some other unexpected item that requires some more concession, that the other party doesn't feel like they've already been bled dry and that they just would rather see you jump off a cliff than get one more dollar out of them. This is an example that I've told clients over the years about. It's probably been 10 years ago. I had sellers who were so angry with an offensive initial offer on the subject of goodwill, they could not see straight after the initial lowball offer, even though those same buyers eventually came up to a perfectly reasonable price, a price that was so reasonable you would have never guessed it from the initial offer. Yeah, which we're going to discuss that a little bit more later in the session. But the problem was the sellers eventually were able to see their way through to getting a deal struck, but the problem was they never really got over having been really offended by the very opening salvo in this negotiation. And we can't possibly have a contract that is long enough in words and pages that it can ensure that everybody is always on the very same page. There's always room for divergent expectations. And so I had sellers who stayed easily within the letter of the contract, but every single little opportunity that my sellers had to stick a knife into the buyers and twist it, the sellers did it. Every possible opportunity, because they were still furious at an offensive opening offer. With buyers they ultimately signed a contract with. I mean, they ultimately came to a meeting of the minds, but they never got over it. Failure to set appropriate expectations. So the classic example here, although there are others, the classic example here is you receive an offer. Your seller, and you're on the listing side. You and your sellers discuss it. You and your sellers formulate a good faith counteroffer. And then, and only then, do you hear from the other agent, yep, they're not moving. Well, then at that point, your sellers have already formulated a counter. If you had known that up front, you would have probably had a different conversation with the sellers. Now your sellers have to decide, do we just dig our heels in, which is the natural psychological instinct, or do you make the seller overcome a major psychological barrier to counter their own counter offer? And that's, because sellers have to swallow, either party has to swallow really hard if you run up against a, I'm not moving so much as a penny, and then the other, so what you've done is you've really just sort of created a huge barricade, and the only way that you're moving forward at that point is if the other party swallows really hard and decides, you know what, I'm the last one that put a counteroffer out on the table, and now I'm going to counter my own counteroffer. It's a very, very difficult position to put people in. So failure to set appropriate expectations. So if you know you have a buyer who's being ambitiously aggressive on price, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later in the session, but if you know it's going to be a one-shot take it or leave it, or we're coming in 15 or 20% below list and they're not going to move by much, lay the expectation out there so that whenever possible you don't leave a party on the other side saying, well, I never saw that coming. Failure to recognize hot button issues while you're pressing the button. So as I said earlier, residential transactions tend to be emotionally charged. Unexpected items can provoke a negative reaction from either party. And again, this is especially true with residential. You're dealing with people's houses, you're dealing with their lives, you're dealing with their having to move all of their earthly possessions and their children and their pets. Always be attentive to what negative or positive hot buttons your clients might be pushing on the other party. So I have a couple of examples that came to mind, and I'm eager to hear any of yours. Buyers ask for various items of furniture because they love how perfect it looks in the house. Sellers get ticked off. They're offended. Have any of you ever had that happen? I've had it happen more than once, where the sellers are either offended or, at best, weirded out. And I'm like, relax. All it means, say no if you don't want to sell any of your stuff. All it means is they think you have good taste. Take it as a compliment. Settle down. But it's just one of those things where it's just, well, that's my stuff, that's my house, that, it's just, you've got a lot of emotion wrapped up in it. So that's one example that I've seen more than one time. The other example would be you get buyers maybe who push really, 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 really hard for a particular closing date when the buyer could flex. It's not going to ruin their life. They could flex by a week either way. And the reason that the sellers are being inflexible or coming across as inflexible is because they've got some major life event. They've got, for example, a major family wedding, and they're stressed out over that, especially if it's in the example of an adult kid about to get married and it's local and they're hosting, and they can't even get their mind wrapped around the possibility of doing a real estate closing and moving all of their earthly possessions at that time. So you'll notice so far the recurring theme is emotionally charged aspects of our residential real estate transactions. But you always need to do your best to sensitize your client to the other party if the other party is reacting because of something like this. Substituting your opinion for your client's. And this can happen quite a lot. I tell my buyer clients when I sort of do my initial buyer consultation, I'm not going to do this, and then I have a hard time not doing it. So let's say that you're representing a buyer who's going to make an offer on a property, and you've done a market analysis and you've determined that the property that they want to buy is objectively overpriced, at least by a bit. So your buyer makes an offer, the sellers don't end up moving off of their price as much as you think they should based upon your objective analysis of the market and your knowledge of the house. The buyer, however, doesn't want to lose the house and would go ahead and meet the seller's price if the agent would get the heck out of the way. And a lot of times, and no one is more guilty of this than I, a lot of times the desire to be right can run right over the top of what is supposed to be the paramount consideration, which is helping the client accomplish the goal. If you're on record having said, here's my opinion of price, and here's the data points that I'm using to draw that opinion, and you explain it in all the nuance that you should, and the buyer still says, and right now, for example, but it's the only house in Prairie Fields, it's good enough, and if I don't buy it, someone else will. Well, get the heck out of their way. Be on record so you've registered your concerns, so that if, for example, it doesn't appraise later, or they get a job transfer unexpectedly a year after you've sold it to them and they can't sell it for quite that much, you want to be on record making sure that they know here's how you think, but ultimately, always look at and ask yourself, are you now becoming the obstacle because your opinion is now a barricade between your client and what their objective is, even if their objective is going to involve going above the price or below the price, depending on which side of the table you're on, that you thought probably made the most sense. The longer we do this, the less often we get surprised. But it's really interesting because we still get surprised. And we're in a market right now where we're seeing multiple offers. We're seeing things happen that those of us who've been doing this for at least 7 or 8 years thought we would never, ever, ever live to see again. Reacting badly to a good offer because of a bad agent. One of the things that I have found interesting as I network with colleagues from other parts of the state and country is, I think, well, we're in a local association of only 450, and there's really only about 100 of us that make a living selling real estate. So we all tend to know each other. What I find really interesting is you get into Chicago proper, you get into very, very, very highly populated areas, and this issue still happens because you're dealing with the same small group of agents that will tend to dominate specific neighborhoods or specific high-rise condo buildings. So the issue happens everywhere, but we'll have emotional baggage attached to an agent that in our mind hosed us or was unresponsive or in some manner or other was a problem before. And it doesn't mean, of course, that that agent that you may legitimately have a negative opinion of isn't capable of bringing you a good offer. In fact, I would encourage you to stop and think of the fact that if part of why you don't like the other agent is because the agent is lazy or the agent does not look out for their client, in some cases that may actually mean that there's a real opportunity for you on your side of the transaction because you are more diligent. I remember years ago, and the agent's not in the business anymore, but I remember years ago I had clients that were making an offer on at the time, a pretty expensive property. It was a fairly big transaction for me at the time. I knew enough about the way the other agent was wired and how lazy that person was that I knew no matter what the offer was, no matter how bad it was, that agent's going to be pushing his client to take the offer, take the offer, take the offer. We literally wrote an offer significantly lower than we would have only because I knew full well that agent would not do his job well and that my clients would get a better deal because he would simply tell his clients to just pressure him to take it. I remember the buyers, after I'd kind of run the comps, saying, sure looks like that's priced well at full list price. I remember on Caravan that week the feedback being, man, if anything, that's priced a little low. So my clients were ready to write a full price offer, but there were no other offers that we were aware of, and I said, here's the thing, I think you could probably get it for less than list price. I mean, my background with that agent suggests that you can. So it's interesting how under the right set of circumstances you take your low opinion of the other agent and you can in some cases use that to your advantage. But just be careful, going back to the emotionally charged component of this business, be very careful that the fact that you react just at a visceral level, that you react negatively to the agent that's bringing you that offer for maybe perfectly good reasons, but it will taint the whole view of the offer. So I mean, if you were to wipe the slate clean and look at the offer again, there may be cases where an offer that you initially react negatively to is a perfectly good offer and one that you want to work with. So that's another thing I've seen happen many times. Don't let the emotional baggage spill over onto what is otherwise a perfectly viable transaction. Here's a couple of nuanced ways to deal with the bad agent on the other side. Is the person a crook who can never be trusted? And obviously that's a much bigger issue. Or do I not like the person because I had a bad outcome the last time, even though the other agent is not the epicenter of all evil in the universe? So keep in mind, I mean, somebody who's really evil or fundamentally crooked and belongs in prison, I mean, that's a totally different ballgame than somebody who is maybe lazy or cut a corner or was overly aggressive the last time around. So again, be careful when you're inclined to throw the other agent under the bus or throw the offer out because the agent is viewed unfavorably by you, to think really critically of that. I'll tell you about an example where I was the epicenter of all evil in the universe to another agent. I know, it's shocking. Got an offer on a property I'd had on the market for quite a long time. It was not an easy property to sell. Very, very inexpensive, not easy to get sold. Got an offer from a good faith owner occupant. It was in a price range where you maybe would get investors, but we had gotten an offer from a good faith owner occupant. It was contingent upon either FHA or some 100% financing, maybe an IDA type of deal. And then we had negotiated that back and forth, had the meeting of the minds, had the yeses. We've talked about this in our multiple offer conversation last month. And then at the last possible second, another offer came in. And it was for more money, and I believe it was cash because I think it was an owner-occupant, but I believe they were borrowing from Bank of Dad or from Bank of Employer, one of the two. But for our purposes, it was cash. It was higher, cash, closing fast. I believe it also had no inspection contingency. I mean, so it was one of those where it wasn't even close. And so then I got to be the guy who, I liked the agent that had brought the first offer. So that was somebody I think very highly of, and I knew that was not going to be received well when I called that other agent to let that person know that the deal that was in the bag, as far as that person was concerned, was completely off the table because we were already under contract to somebody else. I got hung up on, the person was just fuming. And ultimately, when I was talking to somebody else about it, ultimately the other person said, but you didn't have any choice. I read the standard of practice. We have an ethical obligation under the code to present all offers and counteroffers. I can't not present it just because we said, yeah, we're on the same page as you, we'll get signatures ASAP, but we hadn't gotten them yet. We weren't delaying, we just hadn't gotten them yet. That agent eventually cooled off because that agent, I think, had the same realization eventually, which is, if I put myself in his shoes, I suppose I really would have had to have done the same thing. But there's a really good example of that was all emotion, and I totally get it. But it also, you have to keep in mind that you need to be able to separate that out and make a tough decision because the code of ethics or the license law or the right thing to do clearly is going to take you in a direction that you know is going to make someone else hate you, at least for a while. Maybe forever, but at least for a while. And that's one of the bad things about being in a small market. You will see that person again, and they may still hate you. Offer clues, mindful of your obligation to protect your client's best interest. So when I say clues, don't say, here's our opening offer, it's just an opening offer, pretend you didn't see that price, we're willing to move a lot. Don't make your clues quite that unsubtle. Make sure, again, that whatever the game plan is, whenever possible, you let your client know, here's how I'm going to handle this. Here's the way I'm going to sell this to the other party. Here's the spin I'm going to put on this. And when I say spin, just to be clear, always it has to be true. Spin does not mean that you weave together a colorful, complete tapestry of fiction. But there are different ways to put the offer or counteroffer or the negotiation into perspective. And so whenever possible, let your client know, here's what I plan to do. How do you think about this? You'll have some clients who, going back to Bob's point about integrity, you have some clients who would say, how many of you have dealt with an agent who made you feel dirty and their client that you met at closing was an absolute angel? And you're thinking, what's a nice lady like that doing with a slime ball like this? Well, so but this ties back into a serious point. This goes back to if you're going to spin something, and even if you weren't going to say anything that was untrue, think about your client that maybe isn't wired the same way you are. And if you say, with your permission, here's kind of how I'd like to play this. And certain clients are going to say, no, I'm not comfortable with that. That isn't going to portray the image of who I am that I'm comfortable with. So you always have to recognize that even if you're being completely within the code of ethics and the license law, as agents of a principal, it is our obligation to represent their best interests and also to try to put their best foot forward, and to the extent that they have an opinion, do it in a way that reflects who they are. So that just goes back to always be in the habit of, no matter how small the item is, with your permission, here's what I have in mind. Does that sound okay to you? Or ask a couple more questions. Here's generally what I'm thinking. I can get into a little more detail because it may be make a more compelling case for you. But if I go into this level of detail, to go back to Edna's point, it's possible that you may have an exploitative other party who then feels like they could use that information against you. So with your permission, here's what the direction I'm heading. What do you think? Or here's exactly what I plan to do. Is this okay? Make sense? Whenever possible, and if there's any chance that your client is somebody with their attorney on speed dial, and if their attorney happens to have any portion of their practice devoted to litigation, you may want to follow it up with an email and just say, hey, get in the habit anytime you think that there's any chance your client could turn on you, get in the habit of, as soon as you hang up the phone, and let them know before you hang up the phone, I'm going to send you a quick email to recap in writing the summary of what we discussed. Just send me a quick reply to say, yep, that's consistent. That's a very easy way to cover your tracks if you need to. That way, if it goes badly and the client says it's your fault, you can say, no, this is my idea, this is my advice, but I asked you, you made the final decision. You don't have to do that in all cases, but always think, is there any reasonable chance this client could end up seriously flared up if it didn't go well, and then claim it was my fault? An email makes that so much easier than it used to. Make a positive first impression. Discourage buyers from making crazy lowball initial offers if they truly want the property. The buyer's theory is, and raise your hand if you've ever heard this, but grammatical error, ouch, it leaves me more negotiating room. I'm going to start out offensively low because it will leave me more room to negotiate. Surely you've all heard that. I've heard it more times than I can count. That's great. Step one, tick off the other party, make them so angry and offended that they can't see straight. Yeah, you can't possibly go wrong with your negotiation after that. I already told you the story of how I had sellers that couldn't see straight, and so we eventually got under contract, and the sellers were furious the whole time and stuck a knife in the buyers every single time they had the chance to do so. Post-inspection repairs. Here is the letter of that agreement. We are doing exactly what it says, and if there's a cheap, half-assed way to get it done, that is the way we're going, and we dare you to make an issue of it. This is every step all the way to closing was the way they treated it, because they had felt like the buyers had fundamentally disrespected them right out of the gate, and they never got over it. Make sure you educate your client about the importance of making that positive first impression. Now, put yourself on the seller side. It's the only difference in the title of this slide is I went from buyer to seller. Put yourself on the seller side of the table. And the same logic applies here. I got an offer. You're on the listing side. You're talking to your seller about how to formulate a counteroffer. And the seller says, well, I'm only going to come off of list price by 0.25% because I want to leave myself plenty of room to negotiate. That's just great, because when you lose the buyer and the next update is they've gone and made an offer on another property, what does the seller tell you? Seller says, but I would have negotiated more, right? Well, that doesn't really help us now, does it? Because you let the buyer walk away from the very first step. It's critical that you make sure that at the point of a counteroffer, the top objective above all else, keep the other party at the table. It's nice if you get the deal done at that particular step with that particular counteroffer, but if you don't get a deal at that step, the very, very, very most important thing is at least keep them at the table. If you don't, then you have totally failed. And then it does not matter how much more the seller was willing to negotiate. And we hear this from our clients all the time. So the sellers say, I would have moved more, becomes a moot point. You have to make the favorable impression. And so my suggestion for how you approach this is, whenever possible, generally seek to avoid the I never saw that coming. Telegraph when your clients are getting close to their top or bottom dollar. I'm going to give you an example of how you would send appropriate signals and try to balance that with keep them at the table. You are often going to be privy to what your seller's bottom line absolute lowest price they could take is, and you're often, but not always, going to be privy to what your buyer's top dollar price is. And if you know that that they're going to make an offer that comes in, let's just, to use round numbers, let's say it's a $200,000 listing. They make an initial offer of, they want to make an initial offer. Let me take that back. Their mother-in-law from some small town in Kentucky wants them to make an initial offer of $165 because that's what you do. And when it's a reasonably priced house, and you get them to make an initial offer that begins with a 1.9 on a $200,000 listing, because again, psychologically, that's huge. Huge that it not begin in the $10,000 column with something that's in a whole different category. So you get them somewhere north of the 190 barrier as a starting point. And if you're on the seller's side and the seller is willing to end up as low as 194, don't let the seller, if you can help it, don't let the seller make an initial counteroffer of 199. Suggest that the seller cover $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 right at that very first step, and make sure you tell them, because it will freak them out. Make sure you tell them that doesn't mean that I'm expecting a $3,000 or $4,000 move on the next two go-rounds. What I'm telling you is if you lose that buyer because your counteroffer doesn't keep their attention, then it doesn't matter how much more you were willing to move. So with that in mind, my suggestion to you, Mr. Seller, is let's front load the movement, the amount of territory that you're willing to cover on price. So on that very first counteroffer, if it came in at 192 and their list priced at 199.9, go ahead and come down to 196.9, for example. Even if the total distance you're willing to cover was 5 or 6, go ahead and cover half of it in that very first step. Going back to telegraphing signals, you want it to be obvious, relatively speaking, that you're putting on the brakes. You don't want to leave the other party saying, gee, I never saw that coming after the negotiations have stalled out. So when you go from 199 to a first counter at 196.9, and you've covered, I went to law school to avoid math, $3,000, I believe. Then on that next one, instead of 196.9, you go to 195.5. Okay, so what does that tell you if you're on the buyer's side? What does it tell you if you're the buyer's agent? Yeah, they're putting on the brakes, as opposed to doing something really abruptly and then telling them after the fact that was it, and then putting somebody in the position of having to counter their own counteroffer. So front load the territory you cover in that very first go-round, because you have to keep the other party's attention. You have to keep them at the table or all else is lost. Let your client know, who's going to freak out at the idea that you're suggesting that they move that much that fast. Make sure you reassure them. I don't expect you to do that multiple times. My whole strategy is cover more of that distance the first time, because I would much, much rather Mr. Buyer or Mr. Seller know that I'm limited to a tiny, tiny remaining range, and then all we can afford to do if you cover this much distance in the first go-round is move by 1,000 and then by 500. And the 500 is obviously, on a $200,000 house, just a token. It's way more symbolic than substantive. Make sense? The other interesting thing is, be sensitive to hair splitting. $500 on a $200,000 transaction is clearly within hair splitting territory, but don't necessarily underrate hair splitting, because you never know when the other party is starting to think, man, this is going to take me lower than I had set as my bottom dollar price, but I don't want to have my house back on the market. I'm tired of the showings. How many of you have had sellers where they signed an offer lower than they thought because they hated the showings? It's amazing the things that will motivate your sellers. They're screaming uncle because their lives are being ruined by the stampede of people that you promised that you would deliver to their door if they listed with you. I'm making it happen. Make it stop. I'll do anything. So anyway, don't ever underestimate that. So they may be in a position where they have to go lower than the bottom line price they had set for themselves. What they won't do is they're not quite to the point they'd cross the psychological barrier of, if the buyer completely stalls out, that the seller will counter their own counteroffer and accept an offer that was 2 steps ago. Make that last $500 counteroffer on the buyer's side. Yes, it's hair splitting. It may be all that the seller is looking for, to have some little olive branch to reach out and grab. Sometimes the symbolism really is more important than the substance in the negotiations. So obviously recognize if you got a client, or if you're getting the vibe that the party on the other side is offended and annoyed by hair splitting, and that is going to be the sort of thing where, forget that last $500, it'll probably end up coming up in the home inspection anyway. then cut to the chase if the circumstances warrant it. But don't always, because you happen to be annoyed by the hair splitting process, don't always disregard that, because sometimes that last $500, that last 0.25% on price is all that the other party needed as their excuse to say yes. They were looking for an excuse to say yes. They wouldn't have said it if there was no movement at all, but $500 is enough of an excuse to do it. Cite an externality to deflect blame from your client. We don't like to be the agent of Mr. Inflexible. And in many cases, we're only the agent of Mr. Inflexible, not because Mr. Inflexible is recreationally inflexible, not because the seller wants to tick off the buyers. Most common situation that we encounter is we got an equity position issue. My seller could not love your buyers anymore, Mr. Buyer's agent. But they couldn't accept that offer even if they wanted your person to have it for that price. They got a mortgage balance that already is going to have them bringing cash in at full list price. There's only so much cash they can bring in. It's simply not possible. It isn't an issue of not liking your buyers and not wanting to see them in that house. Get in the habit of doing that. When you're on the receiving end of sales treatment, what's a really easy technique? For those of you who are married, if you're in a sales experience on the consumer end by yourself, what is the easiest delay tactic? Suddenly your spouse becomes an evil obstructionist. I can't do that. I would love to do this right now. I got a spouse at home I got to talk to, or else she'll kill me. This happened when I was buying my car. Some of you have heard this story, but when I bought my car, oh, it happened great, Max. Au contraire. My wife had lost all of the keys to the car that I had been driving, like all of them, and they're electronic and had to be special ordered. So we had a vehicle that was disabled in the Mahomet Community Center parking lot for a week. So we're down to one car. I dropped my wife off for work on a Saturday, and while she was stuck there with no transportation, I grabbed my stepdad and went to Springfield and bought a new car. So that I'd have a driver to bring the other one back. So while I'm talking to the sales guy, and he knows I'm in real estate, he knows I'm in sales. I mean, I've only met him for the first time that day. Oh, and this is also the same guy with whom I drove around through Springfield residential neighborhoods to find a RE/MAX sign with the same sign writer positioning to make sure it would fit in the trunk of the car. So we, cruised around neighborhoods until we found a RE/MAX sign with the very same riders. Said, hang on just a second, throw the car and park. There's kids playing on the street. Get out of the car, pull a stranger's sign out of the yard, put it in the trunk, close the trunk latches, that's all I need, pop the trunk back open, sign goes back in, and we take off before the police even get there. So, I mean, all of this happened the same day. So we get into the negotiations on price, and I said to this guy, when we're in this last, $1,000 or $2,000, I mean, for the price of the car, it wasn't the end of the world, and I said, I hate to be that guy, but because we know how it feels if our clients do this. But I have this spouse that hasn't technically authorized this purchase, who's not here right now. The guy cuts me off. He puts up a hand and goes, say no more. I understand. I have a girlfriend at home too, tiny fists of fury. So for the rest of the conversation, we referenced the tiny fists of fury that awaited me if I didn't get the deal that I needed to get. All of this is to say, use a third party, use an externality as an excuse for why it is that you're stuck in the range that you're stuck in. It helps depersonalize it. Because one of the problems that can happen, and it's one of the things that we're at risk with by having intermediaries, is you don't have the buyers and sellers looking eyeball to eyeball. So it can get colored by the agent. And why are they like that? Why are they being so inflexible? So make sure that if there's an external factor in play, that you explain that. Use it as an excuse, but also as a legitimate explanation when it applies. And also, one of the things I like hearing from Nick most is, give me the story. Give me the story. I have to have something to tell my people. I can't just go back to them with that. Usually if Nick says that, what he means is, you just delivered me a big pile of crap. And I at least have to have an explanation to deliver with the pile of crap. So, but that's the thing. Give me the story. Give me something I can tell my people. So use whatever their circumstances are if you're authorized to do it, mindful of your obligation not to do anything that would compromise their interest. But in the case of, hey, listen, they got a mortgage of X, they simply can't go below this price no matter how much they would like to. They'd love to see your people in the house, but this is it for them. Make them sound like the nicest people on earth. Be optimistic in the negotiations. The title of the book about the RE/MAX story, everybody wins. So, we want, in residential real estate, these really should be win-win situations most of the time. Be optimistic. Think, on the flip side of it, think of the agent who, when the phone rings and you see them on the call ID, even if they're bringing you an offer on a property that you have listed that you desperately want to sell, think of the agent whose name, if your phone were to buzz right now and you looked at it, just think about that. Don't be that agent. Go into it with an optimistic and positive attitude. You want to have momentum. You want the other party to feel like, even if the offer comes in the door at a little less than what the other party was hoping to see, an optimistic attitude and being cheerful about it helps a lot with the momentum. Because the flip side of that is, if you are not optimistic and positive in your negotiations, it will just have this effect of sucking all of the wind out of the sails of the transaction. It's very hard to describe, but those of you who have been in this for a long time can surely think of an example of, man, as soon as I picked up the phone, I could just feel the energy draining right out of me because of that agent and that personality and the negativity. As soon as Caitlin stops running the camcorder, we'll name all of those agents. Here's one of the other things that sort of came to my mind. So if your client is wildly unrealistic and determined to make crazy lowball offers, you have a decision to make. And this is another one of those things where I can immediately think of which agents' faces and names go with which technique. Some of us will always immediately want to just battle stations. I'm digging in. I am going to conquer the client, and they are going to learn that I am right and they are wrong. And by the time I'm done with them, they will wish they had never been born. Is that necessarily a winning strategy? Not necessarily. It could be, not necessarily. Or the laissez-faire side of that is, fine, they'll do whatever they want. So I'm going to be along for the ride. I'm going to write up their offers, and I'll let them learn when they fall flat on their faces after losing 3 properties. And there's some satisfaction in that. If you like to avoid confrontation, that's easier because it's low confrontation. You figure they're going to learn sooner or later, so as long as I'm patient, I can avoid the confrontation. I'll let them learn when they become 3-time losers. But the risk that goes along with that is what? After they lose 3 times, who do they assume is at fault? It's your fault. You're the idiot that cost me 3 houses.
You can always persuade
That's right.
terrible offers.
So my point with this is there is no single right way. You do have to use some judgment, and sometimes it could translate into an absolute no-win. No win if you engage them and argue with them. No win if you let them lose the 3 houses and they fire you because for whatever reason you're now associated with, that's the person that lost me 3 houses. But make a careful effort to read the client, to try to engage constructively, to avoid angering them, but always be looking for clues and signals. What are some ways to engage without being combative on the first option? If they're about to make an offer and it makes you cringe because you're going to be embarrassed to present it and you know it's not going to go well, what are some strategies to avoid turning it into an argument? Walt?
Strategies of not turning it into an argument.
Yeah. Were you prepared to offer helpful hints for how to turn it into a knockdown, drag out?
I had a client last year that made a totally unrealistic verbal offer to me, and they're saying, what do you think about this? And I told it was very, very unrealistic. But I do know the listing agent quite well, and if, with your permission, I will talk to them verbally, rather than take the emotion of writing up an offer and then having to hear no. And having explained their scenario to the listing agent, strangely enough, we got the deal put together. And
Good idea.
Totally unrealistic.
But it happened to be the 1 in 1,000.
No, you choose...
The one that you never tell anybody else happened because it's much harder to talk the next one out of doing something crazy. Yeah, so Max and Walt actually brought up 2 different ends of the same continuum. You know, Walt, if you're undermotivated, you know, the cost of losing is fine. And you will have some investors. Investors are a good example. Ideally, investors are completely detached from emotion. 100% unemotional. They don't care if they're hurting other people's feelings. To them, it's just an investment. And even though if they're making offers on owner-occupied houses, it's somebody else's life. But the reality is they're willing to lose 3 or 4 houses in a row, and they don't mind if they run the agent around, and they also aren't going to hold it against the agent if they don't get them, if it's an investor. In your situation, that proved to be a really good strategy because you know you were looking at a 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 100 chance that if you had sat down and taken the time right out of the gate to write it all out, it would have been laughed at, but it happened to work out. So yeah, not a bad idea. Test the waters if you can.
I think cultures play a big role in this, and that's one of the things I think we really need to understand and embrace, is being able to understand where they're coming from, but then get them over the finish line, because sometimes that they're not poised to do that.
Ask the other agent when you can, and we have to be mindful of fair housing considerations, so this is not a cultural issue per se, but ask the other agent. For example, if you're trying to decide, going back to my comment earlier about front-loading the distance that you cover in your negotiation, is that the strategy you want if the other party is somebody who just lives for the haggle? You're going to be spent. If you cover most of the distance in the first go-round, you've left yourself $1,500 for however many rounds it goes on. I mean, you're going to run out of room to move really quick. And if you happen to be dealing with a party on the other side who just lives for the haggle, they were willing to end up at the same final destination, but by golly, they were only going to derive maximum pleasure if you went back and forth no fewer than 16 times. Well, that's going to affect the increments by which you move. So that's another question I've asked the other agent. Again, having nothing to do with fair housing issues, but ask the other agent, is this somebody who's a bottom line sort of person? Are they wanting to cut to the chase and get to the finish line really fast and with brutal efficiency? Or is this somebody who lives for the haggle? Because that can inform how you then advise your client to proceed. So that's a really good point. So the other thing, going back to the crazy lowball deal, whenever you can, just like I said, cite your client's externalities as the reason why they're stuck where they're stuck. Do the same thing. Use the data that we have. Don't get yourself emotionally wrapped up in it. You know, we get emotional about it because we know, I mean, speaking personally, I am going to be embarrassed to have to deal with this other agent with this crappy offer that you're hell-bent on writing and that has no chance. My time is too valuable. You have no chance of getting the house. You're wasting my time. You're going to embarrass me. I mean, there's a lot of negative emotion that goes with that. Rather than getting into a debate or an argument that gets really emotionally charged, this doesn't always work, but if it's a market segment where there's really good MLS data that shows, hey, listen, I know your helpful mother-in-law from some tiny small town that is losing jobs and has a shrinking local economy is saying that you want to not start any higher than 78% of list price. Show them the data that contradicts that. Show them the data that across the board in our market, it's a 95% selling price to final list price ratio, and that includes places as far-flung as Rankin and Cisco, and that when you're talking about Prairie Fields, you see an awful lot of 99 to 100.5% selling price to list price. So use data whenever you can and just say, I'm your agent. I will do whatever you want. I don't want to set you up for failure if we can avoid it. So I want to make sure you're fully informed, and I also want to make sure you're aware because it's another opportunity to ask this question. Is this a house that you really want? I mean, is this one you could take or leave, or if they're unemotional about it and they'll wait for the next one, or to Max's point, it's April and they're not homeless until the end of July and they don't really get to crunch time for another 30 to 45 to 60 days, are you willing to lose it? Well, if you get them to the point where they say, I really do want this house. Well, let me tell you, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, first of all, there's the issue of you're going to offend the seller based on my experience. I'm also quick to tell people that there are some teams that tout this exclusive buyer specialist, exclusive seller specialist. Quick to tell people I'm a better buyer's agent because I know how sellers think, because I have to have these conversations with them when people like you make offers through other agents. I'm a better buyer's agent because of my time spent with sellers. I'm a better listing agent because of my time spent with buyers. Let me tell you, first of all, that may offend the sellers and be counterproductive. But even if it doesn't, if nothing else, it's going to delay the amount of time it takes for you to get from initial offer to finished. And if it's a competitive market segment, and if it's a house you really don't want to lose, and if there aren't other good substitutes where you're almost equally happy to move on to choice number 2 or 3, either because they're not nearly as good or increasingly the inventory is so tight, there is no choice 2 or choice 3 now. I mean, you're taking a gamble that you wait for something else not currently on the market to come on. So if that's the case, you educate them as to just the added time that's starting out this low, even if they aren't so offended that they can't see straight, just the time that it's going to add significantly increases the odds that some other buyer comes along, and if that other buyer comes along with a much better offer right out of the gate, they don't even owe you the courtesy of telling you they've got the other offer. Our next update might be that your house, the one that you said you didn't want to lose, is now already promised to somebody else, and there's nothing you can do about it. So again, try not to be argumentative and emotionally amped up over it. Try to give them objective data when you can, and then give them logical explanations. The timing issue is not, I can't tell them empirically, but we do know just logically, if you protract the length of time in the negotiations in a fast-moving competitive market segment, it is obvious that you're simply increasing the odds that some other buyer will enter into the picture. And if your folks were insisting on starting low and a more reasonable buyer, a more typical buyer won't, your folks are just really jacking up the odds to lose out. This is another special challenge that came to my mind as I was preparing for this. So what if you're dealing with a crazy or dishonest agent? The considerations are similar for crazy or dishonest, but they are slightly different. Find subtle ways to get proof that your offer was presented. So if your concern is, because the person's either crazy or they're dishonest, I don't know that when I send my offer in that it's ever making its way to that client. Find some subtle way to make that happen. Ask for some verification. You always, of course, have the opportunity to ask to be able to present it in person, and the seller can say no, but the agent can't deny you that opportunity. They can only deny it if the seller refuses. But look for documentation. Look for an email. Look for something. Look for a signature, whatever. If you think that it's not going to get presented, or if you think that that agent is not going to do a good job making the case, it's not their job to make your case. You would think it's their job to help get the deal done if there's a deal to be had, but it's not their job to make your case. Write a cover letter. I don't do this all the time, but if I think the other agent is not going to get it, or is not going to understand it, or is going to be an impediment, a cover letter is a really good way to make sure your message gets straight in front of the eyeballs of the other party. Then there's this issue of how do you respond to this. I got this call from one of our agents. All right, I'm making an offer. I'm making an offer to a listing agent where the response from the listing agent is always, I have other offers. I have other offers. What do I do with that? What do I tell my buyers? I have other offers. You can let your buyers know. I mean, you have to, obviously don't engage in anything that is defamatory, but you can certainly say this agent always claims to have other offers. The person may or the person may not, and then just go back to, you want to be on record if the agent told you that, be on record telling your client so that if it doesn't go well, and if that is the one time in 100 where there is some other offer, that your clients had been told at some point. But then just proceed in terms of whether there are or there aren't. Is this a house that is likely to sell quickly? Is this one that's priced well? Do you maybe want to write your offer as though you were competing against other offerers, whether there is one or not? During our multiple offer session, we talked about that. Don't wait until you've been given confirmation that there's multiple offers, because you may not get that courtesy. It could just be if the other offer comes in better right out of the gate, the other offer just gets signed and you don't ever even get a chance to know there's multiple offers and to come back with the highest and best. So we've already talked about circumstances where just writing it as though there are multiple offers, whether you know that to be the case or not, is the way to go. So if you're dealing with that sort of wild card, that's one way to handle it. Go back to evaluating be on record, passing that along. If that's what the agent told you, make sure you tell it to your client. You can say, take it with a grain of salt because I'm not altogether sure that that's true. And then say, but if this is a property that I think is going to sell fast, and they probably justifiably don't have to move much on price, you're going to want to write your offer accordingly or be prepared not to get it. That's all I got, guys. Thanks.